Morning, everyone. I can see that everybody is joining now, so we'll just give it a minute or so if that's all right, and then we'll get going. I can see my ticker going up at the bottom of my screen, which is great. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll get underway very soon. We'll just give it a couple more seconds and then we'll get underway very shortly. So I think we'll make a start, not least because we promised to get you back to your desks, whether that's virtually or in an office by 10 o'clock. And we've got quite a lot of material to cover in what actually is a very, I think, impactful, no pun intended, bearing in mind the subject heading of the webinar, but a very impactful topic and one which we are seeing is coming more and more to the fore in the workplace. So my name is Caroline Yarrow. I'm a partner in the employment team here at BDB Pitmans, and I'm joined by my colleagues Ian Wasserman and Laura Binney. And as I said, we're talking to you today about the impact of menopause in the workplace. Just a couple of very brief housekeeping points. There will be time for question and answers towards the end of the webinar, so please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to pop in your questions, and then Ian, Laura and I, between us, will do our best to answer those for you. If you have any technological issues, please do pop comments in the chat, and our colleague Emily, who is online, will do her best to help you if she can with those. So Q&A for questions, chat if you are having any technological issues today. So without further ado, and having made those introductions, if we could move on to the first slide, please, Emily, and we can get properly underway. So just a very brief overview of what we're covering today. Obviously, we've done some introductions of your speakers. I will just do a very brief introduction in a moment before we move on to look at the legislative position, the types of claims that could be brought when you're talking about menopause in the workplace, some recent employment law cases, and then finally some practical tips for managing menopause in the workplace. So if we move on just to look at a few introductory points on the next slide. So I think when you look at these facts, they really are very, very stark. So and I think as a starting point, I'd also say we're using the terminology women here because that is the terminology used in the stats that we are referring to here. But of course, there may be individuals, workers who don't identify as women, so men who have not, transgender men who have not fully transitioned and who may go through the menopause, and workers who identify as non-binary. So it is worth obviously bearing that in mind, that we are talking about those individuals as well when we're talking about the menopause. So the fastest growing demographic in the UK workforce is currently women over 50, which according to the Office for National Statistics accounts for about 5 million people. And when you bear in mind that the retirement age is currently 66, but due to go up further in the coming years, you can see that there are an awful lot more individuals now who are working through the impact and symptoms of menopause in the workplace than ever before. So the average age for the onset and going through to go through the menopause is 51, but it can be much earlier than this, and that might be naturally or due to surgery or illness. So, for example, sadly, many individuals who go through cancer treatment may also go through an earlier menopause by way of example. Nearly 8 out of 10 menopausal women are in work. And 3 out of 4 women will experience symptoms, and 1/4 of those could experience serious symptoms. And bearing that in mind, another statistic not on this slide, but from a 2019 survey, showed that 900,000 women left jobs over an undefined period due to their menopausal symptoms. So for some, unfortunately, it has a very significant impact on them in the workplace. So if we just pop onto the next slide, please, Emily. So just to set the scene, and before we move on to hearing from Ian and Laura, there are a significant range of symptoms as part of the menopause. And I would also just add here, when we're talking about the menopause, of course, obviously symptoms will start much earlier, and you have the perimenopause period in which many of these symptoms will start and become more and more severe, unfortunately, for some individuals. So there are physical symptoms such as hot flushes, headaches, poor sleep, erratic menstruation, erratic periods. Psychological symptoms, so unfortunately many individuals will experience anxiety or low mood, lack of confidence, poor concentration, and these symptoms are quite often poorly handled in the workplace, which then obviously can have a negative effect on career progression, pay, job retention, and mental health. There will be many individuals who take sick leave because of these symptoms, and they may feel unable or uncomfortable to tell their manager the real reason for their absence. And what that means is that then processes and procedures may be followed without properly considering what the real reason for the absence is and the impact of the symptoms that the individual may be experiencing. There are a few reasons cited as preventing more open discussions, and the top reasons coming out of the research shows that it may be due to stigma, embarrassment, an unsupportive line manager, and also fears about job security and promotion opportunities. Now, when decisions are being taken about individuals who are experiencing these symptoms, obviously this can result in legal liability for employers, giving rise to, for example, claims for age, sex, and/or disability-related discrimination, and unfair or constructive dismissal. And we will go on, and Laura will speak in some detail about those potential claims in a short while. From a resource perspective, it can also result in the loss of highly skilled senior staff in the workplace. And referring back to that statistic that I've mentioned, 900,000 women leaving jobs because of menopausal symptoms, you can see that that is a significant number. And I think before I pass over to Ian, I think it is also worth mentioning that within the workplace, you will not only have individuals who themselves are experiencing the menopause, but individuals who may be supporting family members through going through the perimenopause into menopause, and who are experiencing these range of symptoms, and that can be really tough on them as well. So as we go through this and talk about how you deal with menopause in the workplace, it is worth bearing in mind that it will impact everybody in different ways depending on how a family member may be experiencing these sorts of symptoms. So that is another reason why dealing with menopause in a sensitive, open and gentle way within the workforce obviously is a good thing. So I'd like to pass over to Ian now, who will look at the legislative position.
Thank you, Caroline, and good morning to everyone. So over the last kind of certainly 12 months and possibly longer, menopause in the workplace has been in the press a reasonably significant amount. And so I'm just going to say a few words, as Caroline has mentioned, just to update everyone in terms of where we are with current legislative developments and recent consultations on menopause in the workplace. So in July of last year, the Women and Equalities Committee of the House of Commons published an independent report proposing various changes to employment law and practice, with the aim being to help in practice women who are going through menopause. They produced a report which was entitled Menopause in the Workplace, and that was considered by the government throughout the latter part of last year, and then early this year, so in January of 2023, ministers published their response to that report from the Women and Equalities Committee. I think disappointingly, a number of the recommendations that were made were rejected, and in fact, I think over half of the recommendations that were made were rejected by ministers when they considered the report. And one of the things that was rejected was a proposal to amend the Equality Act to include menopause as a protected characteristic. What the minister said, and kind of slightly kind of opaque, was it risked unintended consequences which may inadvertently create new forms of discrimination. For example, discrimination risk towards men suffering from long-term medical conditions. So what we do know is that including menopause as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act is not something that's being taken forward. But I think what really, it wasn't necessarily a new form of discrimination that was being proposed, but it was focusing on a duty by employers to provide reasonable adjustments for employees that are going through the menopause. And what we will look at as we come on, and as Laura takes us through the law, and as we look at some case law examples a little bit later, that there are some protections that already exist in that respect. So it may well be that that was the basis upon which those or that particular proposal was rejected. So that proposal, as I mentioned, was one of 12 recommendations made. Another recommendation that was rejected by the ministerial response was for a pilot of a menopause leave policy. Again, ministers rejected that and expressed concern of it being counterproductive. While many of the recommendations, as I've mentioned, were rejected, some have been accepted and some are moving forward in further consultation and in other means. So the recommendations that have been accepted and are moving forward include appointing a menopause ambassador to work with stakeholders from businesses, from unions, advisory groups, in order to promote awareness, good practice and guidance to employers. They will also be responsible for monitoring progress made by businesses, and also to report every 6 months on progress that is being made and the state of how menopause issues are being dealt with in the workplace. Another one of the recommendations that was made that is being taken forward is the right to request flexible working being a day one right. And I think Laura's going to come on to this in a moment, and that is currently working its way through Parliament as part of a private member's bill. And I think indeed that the right to request flexible working as day one right is something that has been cited in lots of areas as being something that would be of assistance to a great number of employees with kind of various different circumstances, but certainly those suffering from menopause are going to be included within that. As I mentioned, it doesn't mean the fact that including menopause as a protected characteristic hasn't been included, that there isn't any protection for those who are suffering from symptoms. There are individuals who have successfully brought employment tribunal claims in menopause related cases, and in those cases they've obviously had to reference other protected characteristics that give them the grounds to bring those claims, such as age, sex and disability. And again, Laura is going to just take us through in a moment those different heads of claim. For example, there was a ruling at the beginning of last year, so in January 2022, where a female employee was found to have suffered sexual harassment under the Equality Act related to the protected characteristic of sex when her boss asked her whether she was menopausal. And again, we're going to take a look after Laura has spoken just at some recent cases that have developed over the last decade or so, which I think really highlight the ways in which menopause and its symptoms are able to kind of weave their way into the existing Equality Act legislation. But what I'll do now is I will hand over to Laura, who will just take us through some of the existing legislation and how that is helpful in circumstances such as this.
Thanks, Ian, and good morning, everyone. So yes, if I could just come on to the next slide, please. The existing legal framework, we're just going to have to think about how menopause in the workplace fits into that. And there are quite a few different avenues for potential employment tribunal claims to arise. We know this partly because claims involving the menopause have already been brought, and Ian's going to come on to talk about some of those cases, as he mentioned. But to give you an overview of the types of claims that are possible, these are basically listed on this slide. So unlawful discrimination, and I'll talk in a moment about which types of discrimination might be likely. Unfair dismissal, whether that's following an actual dismissal, following perhaps a capability type of process, or a constructive dismissal where someone has resigned in response to how they've been treated. Flexible working requests, as Ian mentioned, these are probably even more likely to sort of crop up with the day one right that's going to be brought in. But I think when we're talking about the menopause, people wanting some extra flexibility is probably going to be quite likely to come up. And so the process for considering those requests can be the subject of claims if they're not handled properly. And then finally, a possible breach of health and safety obligations by the employer. So if I can come on to the next slide, please. So first of all, unlawful discrimination. As Ian mentioned, the government's current position is that menopause will not become a protected characteristic in itself under the Equality Act, but that's not to say that other protected characteristics can't be used by workers in order to bring a menopause type of claim. And the other characteristics that are likely to be relevant and indeed have been used in menopause claims successfully are sex, age, and disability. Sex on the basis that menopause is a condition that can only affect females. And as Caroline mentioned, when we say that, we're meaning those assigned that gender at birth. So it can include certainly transgender men who will not have fully transitioned, but still therefore be going through the menopause. Age, because the menopause does generally affect older members of the workforce, typically above the age of 50 on average. And then finally, disability can be a protected characteristic in menopause type claims, depending on the severity of someone's symptoms. I'm quite keen to emphasize that menopause itself isn't a disability. Menopause isn't an illness. It is a natural stage of life, and some might sail through it without any issues, but for others, the symptoms can be really quite debilitating. So bear in mind that the legal definition of disability is quite wide. And so certain symptoms, whether that's physical or mental, will quite easily sort of meet the test of having that serious adverse effect on someone's daily activities, and will also meet the test of being long-term, because the conditions are likely to last for 12 months or more. So to briefly explain how those claims would be framed under the Equality Act, the different heads of claim are listed on the slide. So direct discrimination, basically if someone is treated less favourably because of their menopause symptoms, then this could be direct discrimination if it's related to an existing protected characteristic such as sex, age or race here. Ian's going to come on to talk about some of the case law in a bit more detail, but in summary, an example of direct sex discrimination might be treating time off for menopause symptoms differently to the approach taken to a man's sickness absence for a non-female related medical condition. Then indirect discrimination, a policy, criterion or practice that is applied to all, but puts those of a particular age, sex, disability at a particular disadvantage and cannot be shown to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Harassment being unwanted conduct related, for example, to a person's age, sex or disability, which has the purpose or effect of either violating dignity or creating a hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. And we'll come on to see that some of the tribunal cases so far have involved inappropriate comments from colleagues or other sorts of poor treatment. If I can come on to the next slide, please. Another head of claim would be under discrimination law, victimisation. So subjecting someone to a detriment because they have done something in connection with, something that amounts to a protected act, which includes something that's done in connection with the Equality Act. And then the last two heads of claim on the slide are unique to disability discrimination claims only. So a failure to make reasonable adjustments for disability, that duty arises where a disabled person is placed at a substantial disadvantage by an employer's provision, criterion or practice in the main. And also the employer knows about the disability or should know about it. And I'll come on when we talk a little bit later about practical steps, the sorts of reasonable adjustments that we might be looking at in menopause type cases. And then finally, discrimination arising from disability, that is unfavourable treatment because of something arising in consequence of disability without objective justification. And I think that's quite likely to be a claim that might arise if someone is suffering at work as a result of their the effect of their menopause symptoms if they are serious. And as Caroline mentioned, some cancer treatments can trigger an early menopause. And with cancer being a deemed disability under the Equality Act, then in that kind of case, if you're talking about allegations that surround the menopause, then remember that that person would automatically meet the test of being disabled as a result of having cancer. So to come on to the next slide, please. So a few other potential claims that could arise if someone is suffering some sort of ill treatment at work as a result of menopause symptoms. Unfair dismissal. For those with over 2 years service, then there are only 5 potentially fair reasons for dismissal as listed on the slide. In certain cases, menopause could well be a factor affecting someone's performance. It's quite easy to see how difficulty in concentration, fatigue or anxiety can have a negative effect on someone's ability to do their usual job. And employers do need to carefully consider any capability-based processes if menopause symptoms are in play. And I'll come on again to talk about that in a bit more detail later. A constructive unfair dismissal claim is where an employee is entitled to resign in response to their employer's breach of contract, basically. And it's quite conceivable that if an employer really badly manages a menopausal worker, for example, they're subjected to sustained harassment or some sort of other poor treatment, then it might leave them with no choice but to leave that environment, which could well be a breach of the implied term of trust and confidence, which then triggers certainly the argument for a constructive unfair dismissal claim. And then if I could just come on to the final slide for this section, please. The other two areas that might result in some claims, flexible working, as I mentioned, the right to request flexible working applies to all employees with at least 26 weeks service at the moment, and that's going to change to become a day one right, but it's not in force yet. So those with 26 weeks service can request flexible working, and it's quite likely that even those with sort of moderate menopausal symptoms may decide to request a change to their current working arrangements. For example, adjusted hours or a reduction in days. They might want to finish earlier or start later to help manage their symptoms. And it will therefore be important to go through your usual process for considering flexible working requests and making sure that that's dealt with sensitively and reasonably. It's not to say that all requests need to be granted. It's still very much subject to business needs, and there are 8 statutory grounds that a business can rely on to refuse any flexible working request, but you'll still need to go through and consider the request properly. By that I mean not making any assumptions, thinking about how it will work, perhaps thinking about trialing the proposed change, because there are certain types of discrimination claims, for example, an indirect sex discrimination one, that may result if you're closed off to thinking about the request. And in general, I always think it's quite useful to think about if you do get a flexible working request, your first sort of starting point should really be how it can work rather than why it can't work. Doesn't mean that obviously, like I said, in all cases it's going to work, but if you can think of compromises or something that's going to actually really help that worker, then it's going to be something to think about. And then finally, health and safety. Employers have a duty to take reasonable care of their staff's health and safety at work. While any breach of that doesn't give rise to a direct claim by the individual, the health and safety executive could, at least in theory, take enforcement action. And perhaps more likely, there could be some other claims, for example, whistleblowing claims if a worker is dismissed or subjected to a detriment as a result of raising health and safety concerns here in the context of the menopause. And it's also going to be very useful to think about completing risk assessments and return to work meetings after sickness absences, where you're aware of someone suffering from menopause symptoms, just to avoid the risk of complaints and something that's possibly going to turn into something like a grievance. So that's an overview of the legal position. I'm now going to hand back over to Ian to discuss how this has worked in practice with some recent cases.
Thank you very much, Laura. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So against that statutory background, what I'm going to do now is just take us on a quick tour of some recent cases which serve to highlight how, even in the absence of menopause being a protected characteristic in its own right, that employees are able to and have in fact brought claims that arise out of treatment that relates to the menopause and its effects, and kind of how those have done. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at 5 cases going back over the last decade, which I think highlight this from various different angles, picking at a number of the strands that Laura has very helpfully highlighted from the Equality Act and the Employment Rights Act as well in terms of unfair dismissal. So if we start by looking at case from 11 years ago, in fact, BT and Miss Merchant. So in this case, Miss Merchant was dismissed following a final warning for poor performance. I think the employer had done the right thing, and a medical report had been procured, and that had indicated that she was going through the menopause, which could affect her level of concentration at times. And the report went on to also explain that the effect of the menopause and the symptoms that she was suffering from could indeed be affecting her performance, and it was obviously her poor performance which was at issue in this case. Her line manager, when considering everything in the round, decided to disregard the medical evidence on the basis that it wasn't a disability, and instead made assumptions based on his wife's own experiences of going through the menopause. A number of different claims were subsequently brought by Miss Merchant after she was dismissed because of her performance. She brought claims for sex discrimination, she brought claims for unfair dismissal, and the tribunal upheld both of those claims, having considered all the evidence. And in particular, and I think what's noteworthy is the tribunal commented that the male line manager would never have adopted what the tribunal said was this bizarre and irrational approach with other non-female related conditions. And it commented that the manager was wrong to assume that his wife's experiences of menopause was in any way relevant. And again, so this is a kind of, I guess, in terms of the cases that we're looking at today, an early example of where there was a finding of unfair dismissal and sex discrimination, essentially kind of all of which arose out of menopausal symptoms and effects in the workplace, and how those were dealt with. If we go on to the next case, please. Thank you. So this was a claim against the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, showing that courts and tribunal services don't get everything right either. So Ms Davis was a court officer. She'd worked for the court service up in Scotland for over 20 years, and she had a flawless record of service. She began to display forgetful and confused behaviour at work, and this was as a result of the onset of menopause. She was receiving HRT treatment for which the employer was aware. As a result of her behaviour, so her kind of forgetfulness and kind of confused behaviour at work, Miss Davis was disciplined and she was ultimately dismissed. She also brought claims for unfair dismissal and for discrimination arising from disability. And we've just had a look at the discrimination arising cases. So, as Laura mentioned, the tribunal unsurprisingly found that menopause itself was not a disability. as Laura said, it's a stage of life, and for some individuals who are suffering from the menopause, some individuals won't suffer at all from the menopause, or will suffer to very different degrees. But what the tribunal did focus on was the symptoms, the effect of the symptoms, and whether or not that could amount to a disability. And what the tribunal found in this case was Ms. Davis' memory problems and anxiety that she suffered as a result of going through the menopause did in fact amount to a disability. And the tribunal went through the test in the Equality Act, looking at whether it was long term and whether it was kind of significant in terms of the impact, and found that those were disabilities that were covered by the Equality Act. And further, the tribunal found that she had been dismissed as a result of conduct that had arisen in consequence of her disability. So the forgetfulness, the confused behaviour, the things that Miss Davis was dismissed for were all things that arose as a result of the memory problems and the anxiety, which did amount to disability. So in this case, Miss Davis was awarded almost £20,000 in compensation, and the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service were in fact ordered to reinstate her, which they did. So if we go on to the next case, please. So this was a 2018 case. In this case, the claimant was in her late 30s, and she was going through treatment for breast cancer, which was likely to cause her to go into early menopause. And as both Caroline and Laura have mentioned, cancer is a deemed disability. What the tribunal starting point obviously is that this is a disabled individual. The managing director of Textbook Teachers, however, was unsympathetic to the situation, to both the treatment that the individual was going through, and the fact that it was likely to cause the onset of early menopause, and made various comments to the claimant, including that it would be no big deal that if her cancer treatment caused her to go into early menopause at the age of 37, and that she was no longer able to conceive children. The claimant in this case brought a claim of harassment related to disability. And the tribunal, again, unsurprisingly, found that the comments made by the managing director had been made and had been communicated in a way which showed a lack of insight, sensitivity, and empathy. And indeed, those comments made did have the effect of violating the claimant's dignity, creating an offensive environment for her. And she, in this case, was successful in her claim for harassment related to disability. If we move on to the next case, and this was a 2019 case, A versus Bon Marché Limited. In this case, the claimant had worked in retail for a long time. She'd worked in retail for almost 40 years and was consistently a high achiever in the roles that she had occupied. She started going through the menopause, and her colleagues were aware of that, and they were aware of the symptoms that she was suffering from. And her male manager would routinely demean and humiliate her in front of other staff members and indeed customers as well, and would make comments such as calling her a dinosaur, and would also continually criticize her unreasonably, which she said was related to the effects that she was suffering of the menopause. She would also be referred to as being menopausal when being picked up on mistakes and kind of being criticised by her manager. There are other things that she asked for in terms of adjustments to the temperature in the shop, which again the manager and the employer refused to make. The manager's treatment of the claimant unfortunately led to her having a breakdown, and she felt that she had no choice but to resign from her employment. Again, in this case, Ms. A brought a number of claims in the Employment Tribunal, including claims for harassment on the grounds of both age and sex. And as Laura has mentioned, that there are obviously kind of clear links to age and to sex in menopausal cases. The judge in this case, again, unsurprisingly, given the facts of this case, found that there had been a clear course of harassment by the manager, which had affected the claimant's mental health and led to successful claims for harassment on the grounds of both age and sex, leading to what was then a kind of top band, kind of high end unfair injury to feelings award of almost £30,000 in compensation. So again, this is a case where kind of you can see how constructive dismissal, age discrimination, sex discrimination, all can be woven in cases where menopausal symptoms have led to certain treatment of individuals in the workplace. If we move on to the next slide, which is the final of the 5 cases, which really just serve to highlight and emphasise that the way in which the other statutory protections from the Equality Act and the Employment Rights Act can be brought into play. So this was a 2020 case. In this case, the tribunal considered whether the claimant's menopausal symptoms did in of themselves amount to a disability. The claimant experienced, as a result of going through the menopause, hot flushes. She experienced hot flushes 7 to 8 times a day, which were accompanied by palpitations and anxiety. And in fact, that would worsen under pressure or under stress, particularly at work, to anywhere between 10 and 12 times a day. The claimant would also experience night sweats, and she would wake up a number of times in the night, and she suffered from other symptoms as well, which included fatigue, anxiety, memory and concentration difficulties. And clearly, when the medical evidence was considered, all of these symptoms severely impacted on the claimant's day-to-day activities and were not in any way alleviated by medical treatment that she was undergoing. The respondent sought to argue that these were merely typical menopausal symptoms, so it was a stage of life kind of type argument, and that the impact on the claimant was not substantial. Again, in this case, what the tribunal did was focus on the symptoms, the anxiety, the memory kind of difficulties, the fatigue, things like that, and came to the conclusion that the effect of those symptoms on the claimant's day-to-day activities were more than minor or trivial. They were long-term. They went through the test in the Equality Act, and again, in that case, came to the conclusion that that did constitute a disability, and the claimant in this case again was successful with her claim for disability discrimination. So that was a quick run through just of a number of cases over the last 10 years or so, and there are many more, and kind of in my first piece I mentioned a claim in January of last year, when an individual was referred to as menopausal, and the link to harassment in that case. There are many other cases, and it is certainly an area, as Caroline mentioned, with the changing demographic in the workplace, that employers need to be incredibly careful when dealing with symptoms of harassment. You can't simply dismiss menopausal symptoms as a period of life, or something that kind of is not a disability, because there are so many other factors that will affect employees, will bring them into the Equality Act and the Employment Rights Act as well. So a bit of a minefield for employers, but something that with the right tips and tricks and the right way of managing menopause in the workplace is certainly something that employers should be expected to and should be able to navigate quite reasonably. And on that note, I will hand back to Laura, who is going to take us through some practical tips for managing menopause in the workplace.
Thanks, Ian. So yes, coming on to sort of what you might want to think about doing to manage menopause in the workplace. Basically to best avoid the risk of complaints or the sorts of tribunal claims that we've mentioned. Firstly, just as a sort of starting point, I think it's key for employers to recognise that while menopause has traditionally been a taboo subject, that is changing. It's being talked about more and more. We are hearing much more about it in the news. You have high-profile women such as Michelle Obama and Davina McCall putting their stories out there. And so I think it's going to be increasingly important for businesses to also have that awareness throughout their organisation, basically so that they can support this pretty large section of the workforce and retain that talent. So that's the sort of mindset I think that that's going to be useful to think about. So what can you do? There's a few points on the slide. Firstly, encourage open dialogue as much as possible about the menopause. It may not be something that's been talked about much before in your workplace, but now is the time when I think it should be, in the same way as we didn't used to talk about mental health conversations and have that dialogue. That's now much more normal, and I think that's going to be the way that it will go with menopause conversations as well. As Caroline briefly mentioned, it's not just those who are directly going through the menopause that are affected. It's going to be, you know, their colleagues, family, friends, as well. We'll all know someone who is going through or has gone through it or will do. So I think having those kinds of conversations will help to reduce stigma, and it will of course really benefit menopausal workers to know that there are those sort of visible channels of support that they can access. Maybe do a staff survey as well as a sort of starting out point to find out how comfortable people currently are talking about the topic in the workplace, or you know what further guidance that they would like and appreciate and ask for suggestions. Secondly, raise awareness of symptoms, how they can manifest and cause issues, and how to best support those experiencing them. You could have a sort of menopause guide, for example, that is just freely available on your company intranet. For example, that's different to a menopause policy, which I'll come on to, but just even something like a straightforward sort of guide, a kind of digestible, concise overview of what it is and how it might affect people, can again just be really useful to help normalize talking about it. And I've seen some on some company websites or sort of intranet certainly that can be you know really useful as a starting point. Thirdly, training. So train HR and line managers on the subject. I think particular care needs to be taken if someone is mentioning menopausal symptoms, and you should be taking that into consideration when fairly managing sickness absence and performance processes. For example, you may want to adjust your procedures to take account of the impact of the menopause and focus on a dialogue with the individual about what would help them to do their job, especially if their symptoms are severe. And if they are, then I think it's quite likely that they are going to be quite possibly meeting the test of disability, in which case your sort of usual considerations about those sort of processes will apply. And then that links into offering reasonable adjustments. There are a variety of things that could be really helpful, and some being really quite easy to arrange as well. Each really depends on the particular symptoms that are an issue, whether it's physical or mental. But as a few ideas, you could be looking at something that is adapting or altering uniforms or dress codes to make sure that workers are more comfortable. For example, if they're prone to being too hot, providing easy access to cold water, showers, desks that are near bathrooms, supplying desk fans, allowing the use of a quiet rest area, and allowing breaks in between meetings so that they're not sort of back to back and people get a chance to recover. It could also involve changes to working patterns, like I mentioned, for example, a change in hours, perhaps working from home at times, or changes to company procedures, as I mentioned, with regard to performance and sickness policies. And remember that all of this is addressed, or the aim is to address you know, a reduction in sickness absence. You want people to feel more comfortable and confident when they're doing their job, because that's going to naturally lead to greater productivity. So if I can come on to the last slide, please. This is all to do with menopause policy. One of our biggest recommendations as a pretty good starting point for employers is to implement a workplace menopause policy, if you don't have one already, that educates and informs about the potential symptoms of menopause and raises that wider awareness and understanding among the whole workforce. It's also, I think, a really good idea to try to make sure that you have some buy-in from senior leadership to show that the business is taking the matter seriously, and to sort of embed it into the culture of an organization. You might have seen that, again, in the press, I think companies like Vodafone and Kellogg's have sort of been talking about the menopause policy that they've got in place and what they have to support workers. And that tends to tie in with diversity and inclusion commitments as well. So firstly, why have a policy? Well, in a nutshell, so that women know what support is available for them. It can be really reassuring to know that your employer recognises that the menopause can have an adverse and sort of unsettling impact on your working life that you might not have, experienced before. You could have, workers who have sailed through their sort of previous performance reviews and they're feeling quite uncomfortable about sort of having these symptoms that are quite debilitating. And I think at least recognizing that can in turn reduce anxiety, and that's one of the symptoms of the menopause. Also to provide guidance for line managers who might otherwise have sort of little knowledge about how to manage a topic that hasn't really been addressed much previously. And also just so that there's a clear setting out of how that support will be provided. So what to include in a policy? Firstly, a basic overview of obviously what the menopause is and the wide and varied symptoms and how it can affect workers differently. The support available for a menopausal worker, so who they can talk to, what they should do if they need support and how that support will be provided. You can then cover reasonable adjustments by way of examples rather than an exhaustive list, and also confidentiality, so making it clear that any information provided about health is sensitive data and will not be will be treated confidentially. Line manager duties should be covered, so what is expected of the line manager, where that line manager can seek advice, and when to contact HR or occupational health. A link to a grievance policy we've mentioned on the slide. Hopefully having a menopause policy in place will help to reduce any complaints, but in case someone is struggling, it's important to think about all of your other policies and how they tie in together. So staff should understand how to address a grievance if it arises. And then also a section on harassment and bullying would normally come into the policy. As you've heard, some of the cases that have so far reached the Employment Tribunal have involved negative comments or attitudes towards women of a certain age, and a policy should clearly set out that that kind of behaviour isn't tolerated. Finally, it's not mentioned on the slide, but I think the policy should also contain gender neutral language. Obviously, most menopausal workers will identify as women, but for those females by birth who may identify as non-binary or transgender, they should not feel excluded or outside of the policy. And in fact, they could be one of the groups most affected, actually, particularly when it comes to psychological symptoms. So if I can come on to the final slide, please. Implementing a policy. It's something that we always think about when we draft a policy for our clients in terms of how you'll present it to the workforce. So just a couple of points to consider. Consultation with those affected, so consulting about the content, asking those affected what would help. That could be done by way of the staff survey that I mentioned earlier. An information campaign, so raising awareness that a policy has been introduced, raising awareness of how concerns can be raised. And then training for line managers is going to be crucial. So training in what the menopause is, training in managing menopause related concerns, which can link to reasonable adjustments, that they have an idea of the sorts of things that will be practicable for that workplace. And obviously it depends on size and resources of the company. Training in soft skills to handle issues sensitively is going to be a really vital point, and training in when it might be appropriate to refer to occupational health as well. I also think that having an internal menopause champion, which I've mentioned on the slide, can be a really useful thing. That's different to the the menopause ambassador that obviously is the sort of government side of it, but just someone internal or more than one person if it's a larger organisation who can be there as a support to answer questions and sort of be available for someone who might just want some greater understanding. Finally, bear in mind that having a policy is only the first step, and as with any policy, it needs to be understood properly and applied properly rather than just having it sitting on a shelf. Research indicates that women experiencing menopausal related issues prefer solutions that are tailored to their individual circumstances as far as possible, over and above the blanket workplace policies. And so I think that's when training of managers will be really crucial alongside a policy. And then finally on the slide, I've just mentioned, in case you are interested in any sort of further reading or advice about the implementation side of it, there's some guidance from the CIPD and ACAS, and both documents are a very sort of practical and helpful sort of guide that you might want to take a look at. But that brings us to the end of our slides section this morning. So I will now pass back over to Caroline for any Q&As.
Great. Well, thank you both, Laura and Ian, for taking us through an awful lot of material in a short space of time, but in such an accessible, I think, and digestible manner. So we've got a few questions just popping up. If you've got any more, please do pop those through. We've got, I think, just under 10 minutes before we have to get you back to work. Right, so first question around flexible working requests, and I think the actual sort of process. So we touched on that it's becoming a day one right, but does the 3 months to respond to a request change? I'll just touch on that very briefly. I think the 3 months is intended to go down to 2 months, so I think that would be a shortened period in which an employer would be expected to deal with that. So next question, which I think is probably one for you, Ian. So in the Scottish case, so that was the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, after the claimant was reinstated, was she protected by law to not lose employment again over similar reasons? And yeah, very valid comment there, you know, wondering how comfortable someone could feel going back to that environment. So really, in terms of reinstatement, what is the position with regard to protection going forwards, and not to have something similar happen again?
And I think that's a really good question. And obviously in that case, Ms. Davis was reinstated. The tribunal ordered her reinstatement, and there are then going to be a number of things that the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service will need to take into account. The tribunal found, firstly, that she was disabled. So as when you've got any disabled employees, obviously as an employer, you need to be looking at how they can be kind of best accommodated in the workplace, whether there are any things that put them at a disadvantage. So in particular, given that there were ways in which she was struggling at work with kind of behaviour and confused behaviour as it was, and kind of forgetfulness, that the tribunal would expect, and indeed that the law would expect, the employer to consider reasonable adjustments. So in this case, obviously, when Ms. Davis goes back into work, they will need to be carefully considering and taking medical evidence. They will need to be looking at whether there are adjustments that they can make to assist Ms. Davis. There's also, when looking at, I guess, risks and things that the employer needs to bear in mind, as Laura picked up, there's victimization, the risk of victimization. So in this case, you have Ms. Davis, who has asserted a statutory right. She's brought a discrimination claim against her employer. If she suffers unfavorable treatment as a result of having kind of brought those claims and kind of stuck her head above the parapet, if she's seen as a bit of a troublemaker for that reason, and she's treated unfavorably because of that, then she would potentially be able to bring a claim for victimization as well. And again, the question asks kind of how comfortable someone can feel going back into that environment. I imagine it's difficult on both sides. The employee themselves, that they obviously they applied for reinstatement. Reinstatement isn't something that is ordered by the tribunal unless the employee wants that. So there was obviously a desire to go back into that workplace, but it is difficult. I think you do see it a bit more in the public sector, perhaps than you do in the private sector, of both kind of individuals bringing claims while still employed, but also being prepared to go back into that environment, partly probably on the basis that people move around a little bit more. But it is difficult, and it's certainly something that the employer will need to bear in mind.
Thank you, Ian. I think the next question probably could go to either of you, but Laura, I think you've touched on this to some extent already in your last set of slides. So the menopausal ambassador that we mentioned earlier, which I think Ian mentioned when looking at the response to that consultation on menopause in the workplace. So the menopausal ambassador you mentioned earlier, is that for a certain size of company? I think the menopausal ambassador is the sort of central government sort of role to interact and liaise with businesses in terms of these issues in the workplace. Laura, you mentioned menopausal champions, and I think you said that for larger employers, but do you have a view on sort of how big you would need to be as a company before you might look at something like an internal menopausal or menopause champion?
Yeah, that's right. So the ambassador role is not one that sort of needs to apply to it doesn't apply to each individual organization. That is a government appointed one, and they will take those issues forward on behalf of the government. The menopause champion that I mentioned is something that I think any organization could potentially put in place, no matter their size, really. Obviously, the larger the organization, the more likely it is to have the resources to put in place, perhaps more than one, so you have maybe one for different types of areas of the business. But it doesn't have to be a sort of a kind of a big role or a sort of serious one to take on. It really just needs to have someone who is comfortable being a sort of point of contact. And I think if you're able to do a staff survey and you can find out, gauge interest for anyone who would like to do it, then I think it can only be a positive thing, and it doesn't need to be, a company of any particular size that can do that.
I think what I would just add to that is, I think in terms of the question asking about the menopausal ambassador, in fact, only last month the government did appoint its first kind of ambassador, and in fact has called the role the menopause employment champion. So it's kind of a good turn of phrase and kind of references, as Laura has mentioned, to having internal champions. But this first menopause employment champion is more of an overarching role. So it's not, obviously it's a government appointed role. It's a voluntary position. In fact, it's the person that's been appointed is currently head of talent at the Adecco Group, and it is an overarching role, and it's to work with all businesses effectively and help and provide resources for businesses to be able to do the sorts of things that Laura mentioned. So to develop policies, to set kind of businesses being able to set themselves up with having their own champions that are able to take forward these issues. So it will be interesting to see how the kind of the overarching ambassador role, the employment champion that's been appointed by the government, takes forward kind of their role. But I guess that's something that it's worth just keeping an eye on.
Oh, absolutely. I think we've got one final question, which actually it's a tricky question, actually. Is there any recent case law you can tell us about where the employer has successfully defended claims relating to menopause? I think what I'd say here is that by and large, it's the claims where the employer is found not to have handled things well or behaved badly that will actually be make it into the news reports and the case reports. Tribunal cases are available online once you get to some form of judgment, but you can't search, I think, for menopause as a topic. It would have to be on the names of the parties. So there will be some. I can't immediately think of any immediately to hand, and obviously when preparing for this session, really, we want to sort of point out the pitfalls and the risks, and from that, hopefully you can all extrapolate, how to mitigate against those risks. So, for example, if you're dealing with a sort of a capability case for somebody who is having symptoms, Laura, I think looked at this, it really will be things like discounting to a certain extent menopausal related absences, making adjustments in that regard, and if you have a rogue person who will go off and use language such as you're menopause or you're a dinosaur, and some of those inappropriate conversations that Ian highlighted when looking at the case law that he was going through. If you have trained staff, if you've made it clear that this is not appropriate, this is not how you behave, then that is the best possible sort of chance of defending a claim, because you can say, well, we did everything that we should do in terms of preventing this behavior. And of course, excuse me, of course, if someone is behaving inappropriately, dealing with that person separately in accordance with disciplinary procedures, I think is the best way that you can so hopefully successfully defend claims related to menopause. Ian, Laura, I don't know if you've got any final thoughts on that last question, which is a good one, or anything to add to those sort of final closing remarks.
No, I'd agree, really. I'm not aware of any sort of, like you say, reported cases about a successful defence. Doesn't mean there haven't been any, but we do tend to hear about the ones that we've mentioned, really. But it is about trying to sort of think about the ways in which we've identified to try to mitigate risks, I suppose.
Well, we're just after 10 o'clock, so apologies, we're a couple of minutes over, but thank you all very, very much for joining us today. Thank you for the questions. I hope you found it useful. I think the session has been recorded, so the link will be sent out. Please feel free to share that with any colleagues who couldn't join us today, and who might find the session useful. And I'd like to say a final thank you to Emily, who has worked very, very hard behind the scenes to keep us all running smoothly, to run the slides and make sure that everyone could get on. So thank you, Emily, and I hope you all have a very good day and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you very much.